He was standing at that podium, trying to hold it together. Mexico's Defense Secretary, General Ricardo Trevino Trejo, a man who had spent decades commanding hardened soldiers through unimaginable violence, was visibly fighting back tears. He had just confirmed what the world was waiting to hear, that El Mencho, the most wanted drug lord on the planet, the man with a $15 million bounty on his head, was dead. His soldiers had found him. His soldiers had cornered him. His soldiers had ended him. And in the same breath, the Defense Secretary had to tell the country that 25 of those soldiers were also dead, not in the raid. After it, killed in retaliatory ambushes within a single 24-hour window, 25 National Guard members hunted down and slaughtered because they did their jobs. A journalist covering that press conference described the moment simply. The Defense Secretary talking about the death of the soldiers. 25 soldiers killed, an enormous loss for the Mexican military, holding back tears. Imagine that on a single day, that image, the most powerful military official in Mexico barely holding himself together at a podium, tells you everything you need to know about the real price of killing El Mencho. Not the celebration, not the headlines, the price. And what came next was something no victory speech could contain. But before we get to what happened to those soldiers, before we get to the bounties, the ambushes, the cartel setting 20 states on fire simultaneously, you need to understand the full scale of what just unfolded. Because within 48 hours of the news breaking, Mexico experienced what experts are already calling the most widespread and coordinated retaliatory campaign in the entire modern history of Mexican organized crime. Not spontaneous, not blind rage. Organized, strategic, executed with a speed that should terrify anyone paying attention. And to understand why the Jalisco New Generation Cartel responded with that level of fury, that level of precision, you first need to understand exactly who they just lost. We'll get there. But first, let's start with what the world actually saw. Naiden's row. Within hours of the confirmation spreading that El Mencho was gone, the CJNG activated every cell it possessed, not just in Jalisco, not just in the surrounding region, across at least 20 Mexican states simultaneously, 252 separate incidents. That number is not a typo. 252. Vehicles were commandeered at gunpoint, doused in fuel, and turned into burning barricades across major highways, urban arteries, access roads to airports and city centers. Buses were hijacked and ignited. Roads were lined with nail strips and metal spikes. Entire neighborhoods were sealed off, schools shut, airports threatened. Cities that had been functioning normally at sunrise were ghost towns by noon. The cartel didn't stop at blockades. Supermarkets were torched, banks were set alight, restaurants, convenience stores, a Costco in Puerto Vallarta burning, gas stations targeted, public buses lit up in the streets. Puerto Vallarta, the Pacific Coast resort city that millions of tourists visit every year to escape their lives, was filling with smoke and flame. This wasn't chaos. Academics who have studied cartel violence for decades recognized it immediately for what it was, what one scholar describes as violent lobbying, the use of extreme, visible, maximum impact force to deliver a message directly to the government: back off. You touched our leader. Here is our response. Now decide if it was worth it. It wasn't directed only at the government, though. The cartel had a secondary target in its crosshairs, and that target was the men and women who pulled the trigger. In at least 6 separate coordinated ambushes, concentrated primarily in Jalisco, CJNG gunmen hunted down members of the security forces. Not randomly, deliberately. By the time those attacks ended, 25 Mexican National Guard members were dead. Add that to the 8 CJNG fighters killed in the original raid, and the dozens more cartel members eliminated in the clashes that followed, and the total death toll connected directly to the operation and its immediate fallout climbed above 70 people. 70 human beings dead because of a single morning in the woods outside a small mountain town most people had never heard of. That small town is Tapalpa, Jalisco. And what happened there on February 22nd, 2026 changed Mexico permanently. But to understand what happened in Tapalpa, you need to go back much further. You need to go back to a tiny, impoverished village in Michoacan over 50 years ago, and a boy who grew avocados, and never finished primary school. His name was Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes, born July 17, 1966, in the rural community of Aguililla, Michoacán. No empire, no cartel, no legend, just a poor kid in a poor town with limited options and no clear future. In the 1980s, he did what hundreds of thousands of Mexicans did. He crossed illegally into the United States looking for something better. He found the drug trade instead. First marijuana, then heroin. He was arrested multiple times in California, served prison time, and was deported back to Mexico in the early 1990s. Here is where most stories end. His didn't. He returned to Mexico and, remarkably, briefly became a police officer in Jalisco. That detail matters. It tells you something about how deeply organized crime and institutional authority were already interwoven in Mexico's fabric. From law enforcement, he slid fully into the criminal world, joining the Milenio cartel and rising through its ranks as an enforcer, a hitman, a man who solved problems with violence and kept climbing because of it. When the Milenio cartel fractured and collapsed around 2009 and 2010, he didn't fall with it. He co-founded something new, something that would eventually become the most powerful and dangerous criminal organization in the world, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the CJNG. Under his direct control, CJNG expanded into 23 or more Mexican states and established a presence across more than 40 countries on 6 of the 7 continents. This wasn't a regional drug operation anymore. This was a global criminal enterprise, a paramilitary force that operated with the discipline and hierarchy of a small nation's military. He was described by analysts not as a cartel boss in the traditional sense, but as a dictator, someone who personally oversaw every operational detail of his organization. Where other major cartel leaders, like El Chapo Guzman or El Mayo Zambada, allowed lieutenants to operate with significant autonomy, El Mencho trusted no one to that degree. Money laundering, logistics, drug production, territorial expansion, political corruption, all of it ran through him. Every significant decision required his approval. That level of iron control made him extraordinarily effective. It also made his death extraordinarily dangerous, because when you remove someone who controls everything, the vacuum doesn't fill peacefully. The CJNG, under El Mencho, didn't just move cocaine and heroin. It pioneered the industrial-scale production of illicit fentanyl, importing chemical precursors primarily from China through the port of Lázaro Cárdenas in Michoacán, pressing them into counterfeit pills and flooding American streets with a synthetic opioid so potent that tens of thousands of Americans were dying from it every single year. At the peak, roughly 108,000 Americans annually were dying of drug overdoses, with a staggering proportion of those deaths connected to CJNG-produced fentanyl. The cartel also diversified aggressively: extortion, oil theft directly from Pemex pipelines, illegal mining, human trafficking, the penetration of Mexico's avocado, lemon lime, lumber, and fishing industries, extracting tribute from virtually every corner of the Mexican economy. Their violence was designed not just to kill, but to psychologically dominate. In 2015, CJNG operatives shot down a Mexican military helicopter using a rocket-propelled grenade. In 2020, they attempted to assassinate Mexico City's police chief in broad daylight. Their attacks targeted civilians at a rate that stunned even seasoned analysts, with estimates suggesting roughly 1/3 of CJNG's peak violence struck people with no direct connection to any cartel. Bodies appeared on bridges, messages arrived in containers, and through all of it, El Mencho evaded every trap, every operation, every attempt to locate him for over a decade. Initiation into CJNG involved rituals so extreme, so deliberately designed to shatter the psychological limits of recruits, that the mere knowledge of what they required ensured total loyalty through fear alone. You didn't leave CJNG. You didn't betray CJNG. Not if you understood what happened to those who tried. So, how do you catch a man like that? A man who doesn't use phones, who moves constantly, who surrounds himself with an army of personally loyal guards, who trusts no one and controls everything. How do you find him? It turned out the answer wasn't a surveillance drone or an informant inside the cartel. The answer was love. Around February 20th, 2026, Mexican military intelligence began tracking a trusted associate, a confidant connected to one of El Mencho's romantic partners. That associate was observed escorting the woman to a secluded, forested property in Tapalpa, Jalisco, a small mountain community roughly 130 kilometers southwest of Guadalajara. She was meeting El Mencho, a private rendezvous on a remote wooded property, the kind of location chosen precisely because it was invisible to the world. On February 21st, the woman left. El Mencho stayed. Mexican intelligence had him, and they had a window. U.S. intelligence agencies, including contributions from the CIA and a newly formed Pentagon-led Joint Interagency Counter-Cartel Task Force operating under U.S. Northern Command, provided what officials described as critically important supplementary information, a detailed targeting package that helped confirm his precise location. The Mexican government was direct about the hierarchy of credit. The vast majority of the intelligence that led to this operation came from Mexico's own security apparatus. American intelligence was additional confirmation, not the foundation, and the execution was entirely Mexican. In the pre-dawn hours of February 22nd, 2026, Mexican Special Forces, elite units drawn from both the Army and the National Guard, moved into position around the forested property outside Tapalpa. 6 helicopters provided air support. Ground units sealed every exit. When they breached the perimeter, El Mencho's security detail opened fire. Officials described what followed as a violently intense confrontation. Multiple firefights erupted across the property. 8 of El Mencho's guards were killed in the initial exchange. A military helicopter was forced into an emergency landing mid-operation. El Mencho, accompanied by 2 personal bodyguards, broke for the tree line. They ran into the undergrowth, into dense mountain forest, trying to disappear the way he had disappeared for over a decade. Special forces pursued them, cornered them. In the exchange of gunfire that followed, all 3 were critically wounded and taken into military custody. They were airlifted immediately toward Mexico City. El Mencho died in transit, gunshot wounds, blood loss. He was gone before the helicopter reached the capital. His 2 bodyguards died during transport as well. The following morning, February 23rd, Defense Secretary General Ricardo Trevino Trejo stepped to the podium at the National Palace alongside President Claudia Sheinbaum and Security Minister Omar Garcia Harfuch. He laid out the operation in extraordinary detail. He confirmed U.S. intelligence contributed. He confirmed no American personnel participated in the raid. He called the armed forces the source of Mexico's pride, and he wept for his soldiers, visibly, publicly, the most decorated military official in the country, fighting tears in front of cameras broadcasting live around the world. President Sheinbaum stepped forward with her message to the nation. The most important thing at this moment is to guarantee peace and safety for all the population of Mexico. Peace and safety. Those words were immediately catastrophically put to the test. Tomatalol Setches, for Nuriel Maidley, catastrophically put to the test. For ordinary people, for civilians, for tourists, those 48 hours were something out of a nightmare. Guadalajara transformed into a ghost town. Puerto Vallarta, a resort city, a destination where Americans and Europeans go to unplug and relax on Pacific beaches, was burning. One Chicago resident with a winter home in Puerto Vallarta walked out that morning with his husband and came face to face with a cartel member running at their car with a weapon pointed directly at them. They were forced out of the vehicle. The car was taken. Something was loaded into it, and it exploded. They ran. They were separated. He was pulled into a passing stranger's car by someone who threw open the door without being asked. His husband found shelter in a church, where a priest moved them into the safety of an orphanage next door. This was not a remote conflict zone. This was a beach town, a place where people take their children on vacation. Narcomantas, large cloth banners that CJNG uses to deliver public messages, began appearing across Puerto Vallarta and other tourist areas. They warned of reprisals against U.S. tourists and government officials, referencing what the cartel characterized as American involvement in the operation against their leader. Leaked internal cartel communications unverified but widely circulated, suggested orders were being issued for all-out escalation, and deadlines were being set for the government to deliver those responsible for El Mencho's death. The U.S. Embassy issued urgent shelter-in-place advisories for American citizens across Jalisco, Puerto Vallarta, and affected regions. Hundreds of distressed Americans flooded the embassy with calls. Analysts raised an alarm that cut through the noise directly. If CJNG believed, and the cartel had already acknowledged publicly, that this was a joint US-Mexico operation, then American citizens in Mexico had potentially become targets of a cartel revenge campaign. That was not a hypothetical. That was the logical operational conclusion of the situation. The CJNG knew the Americans helped find their leader. They were not subtle about their fury. Behind much of the coordination driving that retaliation was a figure named Hugo Cesar Matias Serrano, known as El Tuli. He reportedly directed CJNG cells across multiple states during those 48 hours, and he issued bounties exceeding $1,000 per soldier killed. Read that again. The cartel assigned a financial value to the lives of the men and women who had hunted their leader. Every National Guard member connected to the operation was now a named target, with a price attached to them. 25 of those targets were already dead. The survivors were being actively hunted. The grief at that podium suddenly made complete sense. To Romine, by February 23rd and 24th, the most visible chaos was beginning to subside. Mexico deployed as many as 2,500 additional troops to Jalisco alone. Blockades were cleared methodically, over 83% removed by the end of February 23rd. Airports in Guadalajara and Puerto Vallarta resumed operations. Schools and transport reopened. The immediate crisis was contained faster than most analysts expected, but the harder questions were already surfacing. El Mencho wasn't just CJNG's figurehead. He was its central operating system, his total paranoid control of every aspect of the organization. The same quality that made him so difficult to catch had created an organization that could not easily self-govern after losing him. No lieutenant had been groomed to inherit full authority. No succession process existed. What exists instead is a collection of regional commanders, each controlling valuable nodes, Pacific ports, precursor import channels, border corridors, and each now calculating whether to consolidate power or break off entirely. El Mencho's son, known as El Manito, is already serving a life sentence in the United States. Other potential successors include a stepson, Juan Carlos Valencia Gonzalez, and various operational commanders spread across CJNG's territory. None of them commands the loyalty El Mencho commanded. None of them will inherit the organization intact. What analysts expect instead is fragmentation, lieutenants breaking away, forming factions, competing violently for control of the most profitable operations. That competition will not be settled at a negotiating table. It will be settled the only way CJNG has ever settled anything. The killing of El Mencho is, without question, a historic achievement. Analysts compare it to the recapture of El Chapo Guzman, placing it among the most significant blows to Mexican organized crime in over a decade. But the experts asking harder questions are pointing to a pattern that should give everyone pause. El Chapo was extradited. El Mayo Zambada ended up in U.S. custody. Cartel leader after cartel leader has been removed. And the fentanyl still flows. The extortion still runs. The violence continues. Because the enterprise is not a man. It is a structure, a supply chain, a culture, a network of corrupted officials and economically desperate recruits that runs decades deep into Mexican society. Removing the man at the top makes headlines. Dismantling the social and economic conditions that continuously regenerate the cartel, that's work that doesn't fit on a podium. For Americans, the most immediate practical question is about fentanyl. CJNG had become the dominant supplier of synthetic opioids flooding U.S. streets, a supply that had already been measurably shrinking as enforcement intensified, contributing to a roughly 50% decline in overdose deaths compared to peak numbers. But scarcity creates its own violence. As fentanyl supply tightens, street-level distribution networks, the gangs operating through bars, apartment buildings, clubs in cities like Chicago, Dallas, and Houston begin competing for what remains available. That competition can become lethal, and that lethality doesn't stay in Mexico. It moves through the same distribution channels. CJNG spent years building across American cities. And then there is the World Cup. Jalisco, the epicenter of El Mencho's empire, the location of the raid, the state where the worst retaliatory violence erupted, is one of the co-hosting regions for the 2026 FIFA World Cup. Guadalajara's airport, where passengers scrambled in panic as fires burned below them in those 48 hours after El Mencho's death, will in a matter of months be processing arrivals of football fans from every country on earth. The criminal underworld of Jalisco will need to reach some form of new equilibrium before those visitors land. Whether that equilibrium holds is one of the defining security questions facing Mexico right now. President Sheinbaum stated unequivocally that there is no risk for World Cup visitors and that all guarantees are in place, with 7,000 troops now stationed in Jalisco. Analysts, however, warn that as the government continues targeting surviving CJNG leadership and dismantling the cartel's infrastructure, the response will come, and the US citizens perceived as complicit in El Mencho's death remain in an elevated risk category. So let's return to where we started, to the podium, to the tears. What happened to the soldiers who killed El Mencho? The real answer, not the one that fits in a press release, is this. 25 of their colleagues were dead within 24 hours, hunted in ambushes, each one worth a bounty to whoever pulled the trigger. The survivors returned not to peace, not to recognition, not to safety, but to an ongoing war with an organization that is now fracturing, which historically makes cartels more dangerous, not less. A cartel fighting for its survival, competing internally for dominance, with nothing left to lose, is an organization that has no incentive for restraint whatsoever. Think about what it means to be one of those soldiers right now. You participated in the most significant anti-cartel military operation in over a decade. You fulfilled your duty under fire in pre-dawn darkness in the mountains of Jalisco. You did what your country asked of you, and your reward is that the organization you struck has placed a monetary value on your life, has already killed 25 of your brothers in arms, and is now fragmenting into multiple competing factions, each trying to prove it is the most ruthless successor to the empire you just dismantled. That is not a victory parade. That is an ongoing sentence. The defense secretary wept at that podium because he understood something the headlines could not fully contain. The operation in Tapalpa was undeniably historic. El Mencho is gone. That matters. It matters for the families of his victims, for the communities his cartel terrorized, for the Americans whose children died from fentanyl pressed in his labs. But the CJNG did not die in those woods. The labs are still running. The ports are still moving product. The networks built across 6 continents over more than a decade are still intact. What died was the central authority holding all of it together. And what fills that void next is something no one can fully predict. Not the analysts, not the government, not the soldiers who are living with that uncertainty every single day. El Mencho is dead. 25 soldiers are dead. Mexico is watching its criminal underworld reorganize in real time, with the World Cup on the horizon and the fentanyl supply in flux and the bounties still active and the ambushes still coming. That is what actually happened to the soldiers who killed El Mencho. Not a medal and a quiet life, a war that got more complicated the moment they won. That is the story that doesn't fit in a victory speech. That is the question nobody in power wants to answer out loud.